Hello guys and welcome to a new video. This time we will focus on setups, how you need, what do you need for making a good setup, and what specifics do you need for the exact tracks. So we will obviously first of all focus on fuel load, then go on with aerodynamics, transmission, suspension geometry, and so on until we get to the tires. So first of all, starting with the fuel load, then this obviously is not a really big part if you're making a setup. This is only for like qualifying or your races. For qualifying, 5.5 laps as we have it right now, as you can see there, is the way to go for Q1 and probably also for Q2. If you want to do a really fast lap, maybe in Q3, then you want to go for as low fuel as you can. In races, it really depends on the track. Normally, I prefer for a 50% race doing 3 laps more in the tank than you need for the race to really drive a little bit in rich. So we will then move on to the first very important part, the aerodynamics. Currently we have it 4.5 as this is my setup for time trial here in Great Britain. The 4.5 means that you have are more focused on the straight line speed, but you still have with that setup enough downforce to go really good through the fast turns of turn 1, 9, Meggetts, Beckett's and Chapel and turn 15. So this is a really good mixture for Great Britain. Normally aerodynamics starts with 6.6, this is the standard one, and if you're going to the left side as we are right now here with this setup, then we are more focused on getting a better straight line speed than having a better cornering. That's something like that you are normally doing on tracks like Great Britain as we are right now on, Germany, Austria, Bahrain, China, Belgium, Italy, and so on. So this is really where you want to focus, especially on these fast straights because they are quite long, or in this term, the average speed here around Great Britain is quite high, so that's why you want to focus especially on the straights. You can then also turn the aerodynamics even more down to get even more straight line speed. That's something you are doing on tracks like Belgium, Austria or Baku, because you then are focusing especially on these long straights. In Belgium you have 2 very long straights, Austria you have nearly only straights, but still some parts who are very important for downforce. And in Baku you obviously have the very long straight. You can then also turn it down even more to 2, which is probably suitable to Italy, as this is a track where you basically only need the straight line speed. You have 2 corners where you maybe need some downforce. I think is this double right-handers of Ascari, is it called, I think. They maybe need a little bit downforce. That's why go 2-2, not 1-1. 1-1 could be even more aggressive, but then you may lose some time in the middle part of the track. But as I said, this 2-2 is very aggressive and it's really only made for Italy, as this has a lot of straights and nearly no downforce needed there. Coming then to the right hand side, so focusing more on downforce that you're doing on tracks where the straights are not that effective or not that long, or there are a lot of corners like Monaco, Singapore, Japan. Those are good examples of that. 11.9 or 9.11, 8.11, something like that you use at Monaco, as you basically have only the tunnel section and the start finish straight, and those are like really short, so you don't need basically any straight line speed at all. 11.11 would be too aggressive, so something like 8 or 9.11. It's a good way to go, so you still have some straight line speed, but you're definitely mostly focusing on getting the most out of the turns, as you obviously need then in Monaco, where you then win the most time. The problem with a setup like this is obviously that you may have trouble overtaking cars, because you are quite slow on the straights, but still Monaco is a track where you can't overtake really anyway, so this shouldn't be a really concern for you anyway in my eyes. Coming then to the last part of aerodynamics I want to talk about. I know it's quite long, but I think aerodynamics is the most important part here of the setup. 7.9 that are using on tracks like Singapore and Japan, as you still need some straight line speed on these tracks, as they have some straights. Japan has 2 quite long straights, and Singapore has 3 quite long straights as well, so you do need some straight line speed, but obviously still want to focus more on the downforce. So to sum it up, aerodynamics, if you are on a track which has a lot of straights where you need to focus on, then you try to go 5 or less on both sides normally. And if you are having a track which has a lot of downforce needed, so a lot of corners and not that many straights or not that long straights, then you want to focus more on the right side. Obviously there are still some tracks where you can go 5-7, something like that. This is a good mixture of both of them. Like Australia, you might want to go for that one. Coming then to the next part, the transmission. I've personally experienced that going with 65% and 80% is the best way to go for time trial. On every track, I drove not on every track, but on those who I drove on, that felt the best way. If you don't know what that means, if you're going to the left hand side, so you unlock your differential, that means that you first of all have an advantage in your tire wear, so you have less tire wear. And also the transition from traction loss is easier to feel, and it's also making it easier to correct the car then. And if you have, and also the rotation of the car is way better. So for slow corners, this is also an advantage then. And if you're going to the right side, you may have an advantage in traction, in outright traction. Still, I think that 65% is pretty good because you're not losing the car that easily. For the race, I would prefer going for 50% and 80% as less tire wear is a huge thing. I personally think, especially when you're doing 100% races, 50% races as well, this is very important. And I also think that you're not losing the car that easy on the accelerating zones, especially when you're having a full tank. So you definitely can go the risk with going 50%, as you then have a huge advantage in less tire wear. But if you do struggle with 50%, if you do lose the car, if you accelerate, then you might want to go more towards a locked setup. Then if you're trying 50%, then in a race, maybe go for 65%, and if that's not working, 75%, and then going up to 85%. I wouldn't do more than 85% because already that one is quite aggressive. But yeah, as I said, 50% for the races is quite good if you do want to focus on especially the tire wear. Focusing then onto the next part, the suspension geometry, we can do that quite quickly as there is no change to F1 2018, so you still do camber to the right and toe to the left, as is the best in any way. Putting that into that gives you better traction, better grip. It's faster in the corners and also quite good on the straights. You may have some trouble onto the tire wear with driving like this, but I personally experienced that there is no real big issue driving with this, as this is basically the same as F1 2018. I also tried it, doing it the standard way, so completely into the middle, and also doing it the other way around, but it was this way way faster, felt way more stable. So I guess this is no need to explain, because you can do that on every single racetrack then. Coming then on to the next part, the suspension, which will once again take quite a while, as there are quite a few important things that I need to mention. First of all, we are currently driving 4.4, which is pretty much the standard. You basically want to go between 3 to 5 normally on most of the tracks, but I will be specific about that one. So if you move the front and or rear suspension to the left side, that means they are more soft. That means you can absorb bumps more effectively, so you can be harder on the curbs, drive over all these curbs, and drive even on curbs that are a little bit higher than on normal. But it also means that if you are accelerating from like 0 to 100, so you have like no acceleration, then to going full acceleration and braking the same, you might have a negative effect on the aerodynamic stability, which then means that you can maybe spin around or at least have some trouble. If you then put the suspension to the right side, you have problems. You have more problems when driving over curbs. It may mean that you have some trouble. The car can get quite unstable quite soon. That means that you may spin around, at least have some trouble. Also, the tires, it's for the tires quite hard. The tires are getting under pressure when you drive over curbs or bumps, etc. But you still have also some good points. Obviously, you don't have the trouble with sudden acceleration or sudden braking there. So you need to find something in the middle, which is normally 3 to 5. But to really get the best for yourself, you need to try it out. If you feel like you have some trouble driving over some of these curbs, and you might want to go for a more softer suspension. And if you feel like that your car loses some aerodynamic stability when you are braking suddenly or accelerating suddenly, then you might want to go for a little bit firmer suspensions. That really depends on yourself and not what the other drivers are doing or what the pro drivers are doing, etc. Coming then onto the next part, the front and rear entry roll bar. Currently we have it on 1.1, which is quite aggressive and which you normally not find on racing setups, maybe on some time trial setups. But 1.1 means that these are quite soft, which means that I have quite good traction throughout all long corners. Which were quite a few on Silverstone. You have turn 1s and 2, turns 6, 7 and 8, and also like, yeah, basically the whole second sector, quite long turns. So you have quite an advantage there. But that means that the car is not responding as good. So that means that there's some time between you actually turning in and the car then turning in, which is for time trial not that bad because you're having low fuel. But then with more fuel, this might be a little bit of a trouble. This is why you normally have a lot more of the anti-roll bar for the racing setups, as this gives you a better responsiveness for your car, which you do need in high fuel situations, especially at the start of the race and also the first, I don't know, 5 to 10 laps. This is quite important, and I also experienced that having a low anti-roll bar means that you may have trouble in long or high-speed corners with oversteer, which you don't want to have in fast corners, and which really can affect you quite hard. So this is why you want to have a little bit more anti-roll bar, but that also could have a negative effect if you're putting it too much to the right side. That means that your tires are under quite a lot of pressure, which then has once again a negative effect on the tire wear. So this also could be something to work on if you do have some trouble with the tire wear. Normally you want to go for something like 710, 810, 711, something around that. So normally the anti-roll bar is quite far onto the right side. Obviously there are some tracks where you can lower it, for example Baku. Now you do drive quite an aggressive setup, you can look to make it onto the left side more, but normally you are focusing more onto the right hand side. If you then once again focus onto time trial, where you can go quite aggressive onto the setup, you can go completely to the left or quite far to the left. Just really depends on the racing track. If you, for example, compare Great Britain with Australia, Great Britain has, as I already said, quite a few of those long corners where you do need some extra traction, so you want to go for a setup like 1.1. And if you're then driving on a track like Australia, you do need more of this responsiveness. For example, throughout the fast left right chicane of turns 9 and 10, I think it is, there is even though it's quite a long turn, you still need the responsiveness to instantly go left and then right. Coming then onto the last part of suspension, the front and rear ride height, which is basically the gap between the car floor and the racing track. Currently we have it at 4.4, which is once again, as front suspension and rear suspension, quite a standard thing. You probably want to go for something around 3 to 5 on most of the tracks, and you can also compare it to F1 2018, as it's pretty much the same there as well. So if you put the front ride height onto a minimum, so for example you put it onto 1, that means that you may have a loss of downforce as the car is too low and then maybe runs over the track, which then results, as I said, in a loss of downforce. If you're putting the ride height onto a maximum, so for example putting it onto a 7, 8 or 9, that probably means that you have a loss of straight line speed and also having a negative effect on cornering, which means that you're slower. around the corners. So you once again need to find a middle part between not losing straight line speed and not losing any downforce. So it really is quite track dependent. If you're having a bumpy track or a track which has quite some differences in the altitude, then you might want to go for a little bit more onto the right side. Obviously 8-9, as you can see it right now, is quite aggressive. I would prefer something like 4-5. And if the track is quite flat, quite low, then you might want to go more onto the left side. So for example, a 3-4 or 3-3, something like that. And then coming onto the next part, the brakes, brake pressure, I have it at 85%. It took me quite a while to not lock up when driving with 85%, but now that I am able to drive with 85% without locking up, this is quite a good way to go for. So if you want to go for 85% as well, then it might take you a little bit of practice before you can really do that. But if you can do that, then it gives you the best braking power. Without locking up. If you still do have some trouble with locking up, then you might want to lower it to 79% or even 75%. Depends how much problems you got. But really, you don't want to lower it more than to 75%, because otherwise you just need to brake way too early. Coming then onto the next part of braking, the front brake bias. We currently have it at 53%. That means if you're putting it more to the right hand side, so currently 53%, and could also do more, then that means that your fronts are not locking up that easy. So if you don't have any trouble driving with 53%, then you can also upper it to around 55%. When you still have no trouble, then you shouldn't do more than 55%, because otherwise it may be a problem. But if you do have some problems with locking up and you don't want to lower the brake pressure, then you can also make it to 52% or even lower it up to 50%. But normally I would prefer 53% if you're driving without or with ABS. Doesn't really matter, because 53% is the standard one. Depending on the track, you may want to go for 52% or 54%. And then coming onto the last part, front and rear tire pressure. Currently we have it at 23.8 and 21.9, which is also pretty much the standard one. If you higher it, it basically means to have a little bit more straight line speed, but really not that much. But it also means that you have some the higher tire temperature. So if you do have some trouble with tire temperature, then you just basically need to lower the front and rear pressure a little bit, and then you shouldn't have any problems there. So it really depends on your tire temperature. If you don't have troubles, you can basically go more to the right side, which I personally feel is quite good. But if you do have some problems, then you want to go a little bit more to the left side. So obviously 25.0 isn't is the most, so you have the best track and speed there, but still it means the tires will overheat, so you need to find something that is around 23 to 24, and for the rear pressure it's around 21 to 22. This obviously still depends on the track, how you feel, but I feel like something around that is probably the best way to go. And yeah, that's the end of this setup guide. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope I could help you a little bit. And if you did enjoy it, then don't forget to hit that subscribe button to see plenty of more F1 stuff. Like the video, and I'll see you guys next time.